Okay, this is your 5-minute podcast review for Saturday, May 19, 2018. Looking at 5 podcasts in around 5 minutes, and I think I've got a few good ones in this episode. Firstly, go and subscribe to George, Ezra and Friends. If you've got any interest in music, I think you'll like this one. So I hadn't actually heard of George Ezra until I discovered his podcast the other day. But he's a 24-year-old UK singer-songwriter who's really cutting through with a distinctive style and voice and a couple of albums that have hit number 1 in the UK and charted around the world. But it turns out George Ezra is a podcast fan. In fact, he says his second album might have come out 6 months earlier if it wasn't for time spent listening to podcasts. He was into podcasts of comedians talking to other comedians, of which there are quite a few around, and went looking for the musical equivalent, honest, long-form conversations between two musicians. And not finding what he wanted, he decided to create his own. He says he sat on the idea for a while, but released his first episode in February this year and has since put out another 11. And they're great. He obviously used his growing list of connections in the music industry, particularly in the UK, to pull in an impressive range of people, including Ed Sheeran, Craig David, producer Giles Martin, the son of legendary Beatles producer George Martin, Lily Allen, Elton John, and more. And while it's one thing to get the big names, it's really the actual conversations that make this a podcast worth listening to. I've talked about this before, but podcasts are really proving to be the format for the best, most intimate, most unguarded, most honest conversations. And that's what you get from George Ezra and Friends. The Elton John episode is a good example. In fact, all the episodes are good examples. But to use the Elton John example, it really just sounds like George turning up at Elton's house, sticking his mic down on the table and having a free-ranging chat, like they would if it wasn't being recorded. No one's pushing any concert tours or a book or a latest album. It's just a real expletives not deleted chat that we get to listen in on between two musicians. And in this case, a little bit of the master passing tips on to the apprentice. Anyway, as I said, go and check it out for yourself, George Ezra and Friends, and you can use the link I've put on your screen. On to something completely different, Sizzletown. This is a new podcast out of Australia, and it's having a bit of a play with the dullness of late-night talkback radio, as well as a bit of a dig at commercial radio conventions in general. Sizzletown is written and presented by Tony Martin, who most Australians will know as one of the country's most satirical comedians. And he's also a seasoned commercial radio presenter, so there's a fair bit of genuine insider experience fueling the comedy. Tony Martin calls Sizzletown the first talkback podcast, and most episodes, or of the 3 so far, do apparently feature talkback callers phoning in, and sometimes it's a bit hard to distinguish between what's satire and what you could actually expect from your typical late-night call-in radio program. Just to show you what I mean, have a listen to this clip.
Any calls, Matt?
Yep, line 2.
Go ahead, caller.
Yes, hello, is this a call-in program?
Yes, it is.
My name's Holcroft, Colin Holcroft.
Well, hello.
Sorry, what is your topic?
We don't really have one. It's anything, really.
I've sort of got a selection of topics, if you like. I've got leisure and entertainment.
Yep, sure.
Yeah, well, I experienced an afternoon out. Today I went for an excursion and, I went to the Bath Mat Warehouse.
The Bath Mat Warehouse, what is that?
Well, it's like they've largely invested in pretty heavily really in bath mats. You know, they've laid their cards on the table with a name, haven't they?
Yeah, well, it's going to be bath mats.
Yes, there's very few surprises.
Yeah.
To be had, but I sort of, thought I'll give it a go. But I thought, it's free, isn't it?
Sure.
And there's good parking, so I thought, I'll pop along.
And how was it?
Oh, I'll be hard-pressed to recommend it if you think, looking for something to take the kiddies.
No?
There's no log flume or, the sort of, climbing a wall made of tyres or whatever antics they get up to, the bloody showgrounds. I don't know.
No, it's not that kind of...
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's a bath mat here, so they pretty much put all their eggs in the bath mat basket, and I just thought it might be, kill a few hours in the afternoon while I'm waiting for the person to arrive with Meals on Wheels.
Okay.
Which I'm not really qualified for, but,
No.
I'm probably quite capable of preparing my own meals, but I've got a voucher from someone, and it's a bit of fun, isn't it? They come round here, they've It's like a very revolting sort of form of Deliveroo, is how I'd describe it.
Is it?
It's, this food being delivered under clutches.
Clutches?
So they've got clutches. What are they? Cloche?
Oh, yeah.
Something that, you lift it up. You go, I'm on my way to look at this, I've got a cloche.
Yeah.
Then they lift it up and there's a surprise under there, isn't there? Well, this was just, basically chops.
Oh.
So I've wandered off topic. That's right, the Bathman Warehouse, and
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, so that's just a small sample of Sizzletown, and you're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. But if you're looking for something different, well, it's different. And to be honest, it's kind of working for me. So see what you think, and of course, you can do that using the link on your screen. Sticking with comedy, well, maybe this is actually comedy documentary, brings us to podcast number 3, You're Doing It Wrong. And You're Doing It Wrong is a quick 5-episode series, each episode running around 15 to 20 minutes, from English comedian and podcaster Adam Buxton. I've spoken before about Adam Buxton. I'm a regular listener to his main podcast, the Adam Buxton Podcast. I reviewed it back on episode 9 over a year ago, and you should check it out if you haven't. But this podcast takes what it calls a, quote, sideways look at aspects of modern life, and specifically episodes on family, the environment, diet, parenting, and work. And on each subject, Adam typically and comically sets up the idealistic convention, say for what the ideal family should be like, and then juxtaposes it talking to people who don't conform to the conventions, and basically having the effect of taking a dig at conventional thinking and recognising that life is actually much more complex. Definitely worth checking out an episode or 2 of You're Doing It Wrong, especially if you're familiar with Adam Buxton or just into that particularly British style of understated humour. Next up, podcast number 4 is Long Distance Call. Simple setup here, mother and adult daughter, both journalists but living in different countries. Mum is in Australia and is the well-known, at least in Australia, well-known TV and radio presenter Geraldine Doogue. Daughter, Eliza Harvey, is a journalist now living as an expat in Jakarta, Indonesia. Each episode of the podcast is a recording of the weekly catch-up call between mum and daughter. The conversations veer from current issues in the news to the frustrations of living the expat life in Jakarta to agreeing that Airbnb is overrated. I think there's a few of these phone call as podcast concepts around, usually between friends, but I think this one has a bit of an edge being family, mum and daughter, and with the different generational dynamic going on. Anyway, check out Long Distance Call and see what you think. Last podcast this episode is GrownUpLand, and it's quickly becoming one of my favourites. GrownUpLand is produced by BBC Radio and features 3 20 to 30-somethings grappling with what it means to be grown up in 2018. And for a bit of help, they occasionally call on the, quote, real grown-ups at the BBC, usually other more established or I guess more grown-up BBC presenters for advice. I think, though, what's really got me into this podcast, well, actually there are 2 things. One is that it sounds like a very real, honest and funny eavesdropping into the types of challenges facing young adults. Sometimes they're called kidults. Like, for example, being in your late 20s but still living at home with your parents because the prospect of owning a home or even renting, at least in a place like London where this podcast originates, is near impossible. The other thing is just the interesting mix of key presenters. Mae Martin, a Canadian comedian and actor now living in London. Bisha K. Ali, UK-born but raised in a Pakistani Muslim family. Nedj Sedgwick, white male UK comedian, and Steve Ali, a refugee from the war in Syria, who features in a black humour segment each episode, kind of putting first world listener questions in perspective by casually comparing them with superficially similar problems he faced living in or escaping war-torn Syria. So yeah, I guess the overall chemistry just works for me. And chemistry's sometimes a bit hard to describe, but the trailer for GrownUpLand is conveniently constructed like a mini version of a regular episode, touching on all the segments. So I think I'll run it in full. It's just 3 minutes, and see what you think.
Hi, I'm Mae Martin.
I'm Bisha K. Ali.
And I'm Nedj Sedgwick.
And we're so excited to welcome you to a new podcast from BBC Radio 4, GrownUpLand. Each week, join us as we take a topic from the adult world that we're struggling to get our heads around and look to the grown-up land of Radio 4 for answers and advice.
Yeah, we really only look at the big, philosophically complex issues.
How close do we have to be for you to get a friendship tattoo with me? I could do it for you.
Oh, really?
I've done it with a needle and a Bic pen.
Wait, a needle and a bit. Were you in prison?
No, I was at a dinner party and things got out of hand.
I mean, that is an out-of-hand dinner. When a dinner party gets out of hand for me, we crack into their parents' port. Like, we know. Not only that, but every week I'll roam GrownUpLand in search of a new challenge. I've literally just pierced my ear for this programme, and I have some regrets. So I just got a phone to a couple of piercers. I'm just going to go and get a simple ear piercing, just walk in. A lot of people weren't okay with me recording it. Not really sure what they didn't want me recording.
Just relax.
I'll try.
Can't feel them. So, how was it?
The kind of fear of the pain has passed, and now the fear of my friends seeing their saddest mate with a piercing is kind of set in.
We'll also be joined by a special guest each week to try to unpick your dilemmas and solve your problems.
This week, our guest is Ed Knight. He's a stand-up comedian. He was nominated for Best Newcomer at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival this year.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, this is a question from @Henzers. When I was 10, I wanted to be an accountant desperately. Maths was always my fave subject. I ended up in recruitment, and now I'm kind of lost. It sounds like their bliss is accounting.
Yeah.
Follow your bliss.
Yeah.
And also make
Do
it your
you.
side hustle until your side hustle becomes your hustle. Like,
Yeah.
just do it on the side.
Start
and
writing
make it
sums
into
in the dust on cars,
Yeah.
toilet walls, whatever.
And the amazing Steve Ali will put everything in perspective for us. Here's another question. This is from @ImaginaryReally, who says, I want to get a tattoo to piss off my parents, but I can't decide what to get. Ideas for tattoos that will annoy my parents the most, please. So this sounds like it's time for Steve Ali's perspective. Steve is from Syria, and he's here every week to help us with the questions that we can't crack ourselves. Steve?
Hey, Imaginary, really. Your problem reminds me of the time when I was living with my parents. They used to annoy me, and sometimes I wanted to do things to piss them off. But then when civil war broke out in Syria when I was 19, and we had to flee and I had to leave them, I found that me having to get across dangerous borders and message them whenever I could get signal from refugee camps freaked them out so much, more than anything else I could do. So I recommend, if you really want to piss your parents off, go stateless and let border police and international governments do it for you.
So welcome to GrownUpLand. Make sure you subscribe so you can catch our adventures in the terrifying adult world on a weekly basis.
So that's GrownUpLand, and I definitely recommend you check out a full episode. And actually, I think I'd say that about all the podcasts I covered today. Check at least one episode out. And just to remind you what those podcasts were, we looked at George Ezra and Friends, Sizzletown, You're Doing It Wrong, Long Distance Call, and GrownUpLand. That's it. Catch you in the next episode, and thanks for listening.